The best thing about not being a binge watcher is finding something you want to binge watch. And during the extreme community quarantine, I found solace in Dimension 20. I'm going by the assumption that plenty, if not most of my followers haven't heard of Dimension 20. It's a relatively niche online show, separate from the mainstream content I talk about on my channel. And if I'm being completely honest, it's one of the reasons I haven't been uploading lately. During my downtime in between meetings, I'm on Dropout TV, College Humor's streaming platform, watching a very compelling game of Dungeons and Dragons.
Welcome to Fantasy High, College Humor's tabletop role-playing game. It's the beginning of freshman year at the Eggford Adventuring Academy.
Dimension 20 is produced, written, and hosted by Dungeon Master Brennan Lee Mulligan. Each main season focuses on an original campaign created by Brennan. And when I mean campaign, for those of you who are not familiar with D&D, I mean the setting, the story, the everything that creates, populates, and brings to life a game of Dungeons and Dragons. By the way, there will be a glossary of Dungeons and Dragons down below in the comments section of this video. For the D&D nerds out there, please forgive me if I make a mistake. I only have played 3 sessions and I'm really not familiar with the game. So far, Dimension 20 has produced 3 main campaigns. Each campaign features the same players: Emily Axford, Bryan Murph, Siobhan Thompson, Ali Beardsley, Zach Oyama, and Lou Wilson. If you guys are College Humor fans, you will recognize some of these names. In short, them and Brennan make a dope cast. Fantasy High, the first campaign of Dimension 20, revolves around misfit freshmen of different D&D classes, trying to solve a magical mystery plaguing their adventuring school. While it may seem weird for a bunch of 30-year-old-something adults to play 13-year-olds, the show is easy to get into. Compared to more recent D&D campaigns, this one is a light-hearted watch. It's inspired many one-episode spin-offs and a sophomore year livestream campaign. The Unsleeping City, the second main campaign of Dimension 20, is a very dense urban fantasy set in New York City. Once again, it follows the adventures of a bunch of misfits who serendipitously end up in each other's company. Together, they have to stop a greedy and malevolent force that wants to monopolize the dreams of New York City. And while it is personally my least favorite campaign, The Unsleeping City is an amazing watch with possibly the best endgame in Dimension 20 history. The current campaign I'm following is The Crown of Candy, a political high fantasy heavily inspired by Game of Thrones. And while all of the characters are essentially food, this is probably the most engrossing, most stressful, and most heartbreaking piece of fantasy fiction I've ever watched. And while a large part of that has to do with Brennan's fantastic world building, a good chunk of my heart attacks have to do with how unpredictable the story is for both me and even the playable characters. The one thing Dimension 20 has in common with mainstream television series is that they both start with a concept. Brennan, as the game master, has an idea, and that idea eventually gives birth to a world. However, and this is where the difference with your average production starts, before he can create a story in that world, he has to consult his cast members, because the game master doesn't assign characters, he works around them. Once the DM has sufficient information about the characters, he begins to construct story beats. Other than that, he allows the story to grow with the characters, considering 2 unpredictable factors: the playable characters' decisions and the roles.
That was a natural 20.
20.
Nat 20.
Nat 20.
Guy number what?
10.
That's half of a nat 20,
Half
all
a
the
nat-
way up to a nat 20.
Now, rolls are pretty much random. Unless your dice is fixed, there is no way you can predict the success rate of your actions. At times, the PCs of Dimension 20 come up with game-changing ideas. However, these ideas only come to fruition if your roll is high enough or sufficient enough. And Brennan can sometimes be evil because he only allows certain things to happen if the players roll a nat 20. As someone who has written scripts and stories for the purposes of being aired in a showcase, I find this idea particularly stressful. Brennan is tasked with both balancing the cast's enjoyment and the overall pacing of the show. He is also tasked to make sure that the characters are where they're supposed to be for combat episodes, because those miniature models are made in advance. So while the episodes are being filmed, Brennan is writing the story to be played out in the way he wants to, but without being unfair to the cast members. He is also prepared to make any last-minute changes in the event that cast members does something completely off-script. This makes for an interesting dynamic between cast members, producer, crew, and the story, really. This also shapes the way one criticizes, compliments, and stands Dimension 20. Dimension 20 was released on YouTube back in 2018 before they shifted to Dropout, or vice versa? I don't really know to consult regarding that. Anyway, despite, in my opinion, being the best live play of Dungeons & Dragons ever, it wasn't the first. Twitch streamers, YouTubers, and podcasters started releasing online campaigns as early as 2014, with shows like Critical Role, NADPOD, and The Adventure Zone skyrocketing the game's popularity in the 2010s. In fact, despite being the granddaddy of roleplay back in 1974, D&D is Hasbro's cash cow. Plenty of people are still into it. This kind of shift from, more intimate gameplay among friends to actual live streaming communities has changed the expectations of D&D to some people. When I watched Dimension 20 for the first time ever, I had no idea what D&D was outside of the media's portrayal of it. I did not expect roleplaying and performance to be a huge part of it, and frankly, I didn't expect to enjoy it. With each episode averaging up to 2 hours, yes, 2 hours, Dimension 20 can be quite the investment, especially if you're someone like me who has no attention span. However, its form, the editing, and just the general structure of the show allows for it to still be compelling to the average viewer. I think, if anything, D&D is an example of how our idea of storytelling is constantly expanding and changing. It's digitized, gamified, improvisational storytelling that unfolds for the audience and the creator. It's not necessarily unique because one can argue that other content creators have adapted this kind of form for their online content. However, it is one that is, number one, produced on what I assume is a very high budget, and number two, reaches an audience beyond its quote-unquote niche tabletop genre. I watched Dimension 20 with two people. My boyfriend, who will give his input later in the video, and my close friend Idge, who was quite the fan of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. Neither Joseph nor Idge has history with Dungeons & Dragons, but they took to Dimension 20 well because of the story, the characters, and the added details that Brennan and his production team mix into it. Take for example their ongoing campaign, A Crown of Candy. ACOC is very much Game of Thrones, but with food, as I said earlier. It is, however, as expansive, complicated, and rich as your regular Game of Thrones, even with everything in the world being edible. In theory, it should be more difficult to follow because of the multiple authors, aka the DM and the players, writing this story. I mean, considering how difficult it is to follow A Song of Ice and Fire, I wouldn't really fault them if the story would turn out to be a bit messy. After all, too many George R. R. Martins spoiled the broth. But the thing is, they made sure that it didn't. Okay, fine, at times, yeah, Dimension 20 is hard to follow. Particularly in ACOC, I found myself constantly rewinding and rewatching the show to understand its complex magic and political system. This is not to say that the show was written poorly, it's just that the story being told was so dense that I needed something to supplement the voice acting and narration of Brennan. And D20 knows this. They know what their audience needs, and I think they even know that their audience is not limited to strictly D&D fans, and therefore has adapted to them. They come up with creative ways to help people follow the story. If you're not a huge nerd who understands the technicalities of D20, you can still get away with what happens with plenty of added production elements. In particular, the cutaways with their character miniatures doing their actions is one of the best ways to help us follow it. It gives the audience a visual guide to a very auditory game, and allows people to understand complex situations and challenges. D20 also manages to score its episode brilliantly. They alternate between silent, deafening moments and tone-setting background music. Despite lacking the visual cues most sound engineers and mixers have during post-production, they improvise with the storytelling and narration. It almost is like an old-fashioned radio play, and that's awesome. In the very first episode of Dimension 20, each character gets their own specific theme music that fits their tropes perfectly. Fabian, the swashbuckling jock, son of Bill Seacaster, the most cutthroat pirate in the land, gets music reminiscent of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Kristen, a very conservative and religious girl, gets a Southern Christian hymn, so on and so forth. Luckily, the music doesn't always play. During the more strategic scenes, where players are deciding what to do or bickering over technicalities, there is no music. I think those things were intended for players not like me, who are in it for the game more than the story. It's in these moments where the difference in form really stands out. Sometimes it takes me out of the story, sometimes it doesn't. But whatever the case, it makes Dimension 20 different. Nice, but different. Now, before I talk your ear off, let me hand over the metaphorical microphone to Joseph, my boyfriend and college humor fan who introduced me to the show.
Hi, Intrepid hero! It's Ika's boyfriend Joseph Montecillo here, taking a break from overanalyzing grown men and women play fighting with each other to talk about one of my favorite online shows, Dimension 20. Now, as a writing major and author, perhaps one of the most impressive things about D20 is its seamless and deft handling of multiple subgenres. While the very design and nature of D&D is lounged in traditional and high fantasy, the malleable and improvisational aspects of it make it rife for exploring various different subgenres that might fall under the umbrella of fantasy. The first season of D20 very much takes this approach for the sake of comedy. The conceit behind the world of Spire and the characters of Fantasy High is to draw out the comedic juxtaposition between 80s-style John Hughes coming-of-age movies with Dungeons & Dragons fantasy. Fantasy High was the perfect way to start the series. It taps into the natural comedic instincts of the cast members involved while creating an inviting and familiar space for new viewers like myself who don't have much of a connection to Dungeons & Dragons proper. In fact, Fantasy High is the perfect opening season because of how accessible it is. Not only does it call upon John Hughes for inspiration, the high school setting and season-long mysteries leading to the reveal of a big bad do a lot to bring back fond memories of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Whatever your knowledge of D&D might be, your back catalog of pop culture and famous character tropes will give you exactly the foundation you need to dive headfirst into this season. But since D20 is an anthology series, its great strength comes from variety, and The Unsleeping City was exactly the kind of follow-up the show needed. With The Unsleeping City, the urban fantasy tropes got carried over to a setting that's far more, well, urban. Gone were the suburban dramas and high school pettiness from Fantasy High, replaced instead by the far harsher New York City setting with a far more jaded and matured cast of characters in every possible meaning of the word. This season feels far more in line with the novels of Jim Butcher or Patricia Briggs. The D20 cast used the more mature setting to delve into much harder fantasy, bringing in ideas of alternate worlds and shifting states of dreaming and reality. The lore feels denser than Fantasy High, and the villainous Robert Moses comes across far more sinister and despicable than Calvaxis ever did in Fantasy High. The dark tone made the perfect bridge between the first season and the darkest season of D20 yet, A Crown of Candy. This season takes its inspiration from grim dark fantasies in the vein of Mark Lawrence, Joe Abercrombie, and of course, the one and only George R.R. Martin. What makes A Crown of Candy so striking and compelling is that it plays not just on the viewer's knowledge of similar media like Game of Thrones, but also on your knowledge of previous seasons of D20. From the go, it's clear that the casts are still trying to create a jovial, fun tone, working in character gags and bits into their banter, only to realize that even these quick moments of levity might have grave consequences on their characters in this much harsher world. Perhaps nothing illustrates this better than the end of the first episode. Siobhan Thompson's character Princess Ruby Rocks is a rambunctious and rebellious teenage royal on her way to the Empire's capital for the first time. Siobhan, as a player, makes the call that an aspiring circus performer like Ruby would spend the trip to the capital on the roof of her carriage performing tricks. A simple gag, a funny visual to play into her character's background and motivations. The episode ends with arrows flying out of the roadside forest, shooting Princess Ruby down and bringing her to the brink of death. Without planning it, the cast created a perfect illustration of the values of the world and the genre that they have taken up. All actions, however minor, can have serious and grave consequences. I don't think many shows out there have attained the level of genre versatility that D20 has. Sure, it's all fantasy, but the varying tones and settings makes each new adventure a delightful breath of fresh air. It's grounded in the familiarity of its cast, but can afford to constantly experiment and bring in new characters as well. Few shows can be so daring and bold with the way it changes and shifts while still retaining its core heart and soul. And that is something special, worth treasuring.
In the past year, I've been doing video essays. I've reanalyzed and reevaluated my own stash of personal favorites. I've come to many epiphanies, both academic and not, and I've realized that my favorite pieces of media are those that have heart. I've never been more sure of a show's sincerity than I have of Dimension 20. Seeing the players invest all this time and effort into their character, watching them grow not only impresses me but makes me feel something during a time where I didn't think I could feel anything other than anger and frustration. I actually didn't want to write this video essay at first because god damn I was afraid it would ruin it for me. But voicing things out is how I process things, and I need to process this show. When one watches the show, they're watching both the story and the writing process. And as someone who has created, who has role-played, and who has many times considered what they've done as disgusting failures, it is thrilling to see these intrepid heroes or players watch their characters grow into something or someone they can be proud of. They love this. I'll tell you what watching Dimension 20 means to me. 6 months ago, I was locked into a situation I felt was inescapable. 9 months ago, someone told me I was incapable of writing creatively. A year and a half ago, I was told by many people that I would never amount to anything. In my darkest moments, I found hope in the success of my idols because that was the one thing I could do well. There were people who wrote, people who got published, people who directed, and people who acted. And there were people like me trapped in a tiny bedroom with a dying laptop and a cup of hot chocolate who would just watch and appreciate. Except not really. Dimension 20 is a weird mix of both creation and creating, of doing and watching, of collaborative gameplay, of audience and actor, of people who appreciate and people who do. It just spoke to me in a different way that traditional media couldn't. Brennan and the Intrepid heroes played for themselves more than anyone else. The most important thing to them was to enjoy. It's a lesson we tell ourselves during burnout. It's a lesson I'll always go back to. In the end, Dimension 20 is just a game. And games are meant to be enjoyed. Hey Intrepid heroes! Hi, thank you for watching my video. It's a bit of a different one, a change of pace. I wanted to write something that isn't super depressing or anything, so I wrote about something that's very much inspiring me now. Brennan and the gang, just whoo! I hope you figure it out for yourselves. I hope you guys watch it because it is amazing. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, comment, and by the way, if you donate to my coffee, all the proceeds will go to the protesters in the Philippines fighting or protesting against the junk terror bill. If you're interested, I will leave a website down below that you can follow. Hope you're having an awesome day, and I will see you all next time. Bye guys!